Well, hey everybody, welcome to North Shore Online. I am so glad you are with us this weekend. You know, this past week, some of you celebrated, or at least tried to celebrate, St. Patrick's Day. Now, traditionally, it's a hugely popular holiday that's celebrated in more countries than any other national festival. I mean, the Sydney Opera House turns green for a day. New York City hosts a parade filled with bands and bagpipes. And in Chicago, they actually dye the Chicago River green, which was originally done to identify a sewage problem, but the tradition stuck. And even though most of the parades and parties were canceled or kind of minimal this year, you could still buy green bagels and green milkshakes and green beer, even green donuts. In fact, I have one right here from this week. It's a little more baby food green than emerald green, but it still looks delicious. It's a little bit crunchy because it's a few days old, but that's tasty. Now, I'm going to have to swallow that, so hang on just a second. There we go. That took a little bit of work because that was 3 days old. But people don't just eat green on St. Patrick's Day. They wear green. Why? Because if you don't, the leprechauns will pinch you, which I learned in middle school was actually just the other kids. But of course, St. Patrick's Day didn't begin as a way to celebrate Irish food or culture. In fact, St. Patrick wasn't even Irish. He was from England. And he wasn't a political leader or a military leader. He was a pastor. And as a young person, he didn't take Christianity that seriously at all. In fact, he was known to speak mockingly about the local priest behind his back. I mean, can you even imagine someone speaking about a pastor behind their back? Impossible, right? Well, when Patrick was just 16 years old, he was kidnapped and taken to Ireland, where he was a slave for 6 years. And it was during that time, 3 things happened. First, he became a committed follower of Jesus. He had an experience of God's presence, and his faith became the most important part of his life. Second, he came to understand the culture of his captors. He learned their language. He sang their songs. He knew their stories. And then third, and this is a product of the first 2, he came to love these people. So much so that after he escaped and traveled back to England, he trained as a priest and then went back to Ireland, where he would spend the rest of his life sharing the good news of Jesus. Now, at the time, no one believed he would make a difference. I mean, the various tribes of Celtic people in Ireland were considered uncivilized, barbaric, illiterate, irrational, and they were anything but Christian. And yet by the time of his death, Patrick had baptized tens of thousands of men and women and children. And he'd planted at least 55 churches, and roughly a third of the country had become Christian. In fact, within his lifetime or soon after, the Irish slave trade ceased to exist, along with other forms of intertribal warfare. And within years of his death, missionaries from Ireland were being sent back to England and to Scotland. The unreachable ones were now the ones doing the reaching. How did this happen? Well, according to a scholar named George Hunter, Patrick succeeded by turning the traditional model of telling people about Jesus on its head. Now, the traditional model went something like this. First, there was the presentation of information about Jesus, and then people could decide if they wanted to become a follower of Jesus, and then if they said yes, they were invited into community. They were invited into fellowship. You could belong in the church. But Patrick inverted the approach. Patrick started with fellowship. He started with community. He would actually meet with the tribal leader and ask permission to start a community alongside the tribe where people could come and ask questions or receive prayer or medicine. They would invite people to worship with them and to pray with them. And this experience of ministry and conversation would eventually lead to conversations about the stories of Jesus, and they would begin to be convinced those stories were actually true. And that's how thousands of indigenous people in Ireland came to a decision to believe in Jesus. Now, why this history lesson? Because I believe that same kind of opportunity stands before the church today. See, we're no longer living in a Christian culture. We're living in a culture that for many seems just as anti-Christian or unchristian as 5th century Ireland. But the ministry of St. Patrick reminds us that God can reach the most unlikely people and the most unchristian environments And here's the thing. Patrick didn't get this model out of the blue. There's actually a similar picture in the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, as you know, we've been in a series called Restart about what we can learn from the early church. And remember, the church started because of an outrageous vision. Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses all the way to the ends of the earth." And it was that vision that inspired the Apostle Paul to take the message of Jesus into Asia and Europe on 3 different missionary journeys. The first is recorded in Acts 13 and 14. Then in Acts 16 and 17, Paul travels for a second time with a man named Silas and a young leader named Timothy. Here's a little picture of where they traveled. You can see them up through this area of Galatia, which is now modern-day Turkey, into Macedonia to a city called Philippi, where they're actually beaten and put into prison. They were eventually released, and they traveled to Thessalonica and this town called Berea. But when they were in Berea, a group of folks from Thessalonica came down, stirred up trouble, and they had to kind of get Paul out of there. So they sent him down to the coast, onto a ship, down towards this area called Corinth. But to get to Corinth meant Paul had to travel through this legendary city called Athens. Now, why is that important? Well, for centuries, Athens had been the center of the intellectual world. It was like the Harvard and Oxford and Stanford and Washington State all rolled into one. Sorry, Husky fans, I couldn't help myself. Athens was the city of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. It was renowned for its literature and philosophy. It was the place where the greatest minds of that day discussed and debated the latest and greatest ideas of the day. In fact, in Acts 17, Luke actually takes kind of a cheap shot at the people of Athens, saying, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Now, that's a pretty biting critique. I mean, Luke never said anything like that about the people in Corinth or Philippi. It's almost as if he's saying, don't even bother with Athens. You know, all they care about is hearing the latest ideas and listening to themselves talk. And maybe that's why Athens wasn't part of Paul's original plan. Remember, he ended up there because he got run out of town. And he was alone, and Paul never planted churches alone. Truth is, he was just waiting for Timothy and Silas to arrive so they could move on to Corinth. And while he was there, he decided to do some sightseeing, because you can't be in Athens and not see the Acropolis or the Parthenon and the beautiful temples and theaters. But something happened to Paul when he was walking through that city that would leave an indelible mark on the church to this day. So if you have a Bible or Bible app, you can open to Acts 17, or you can simply follow along with me here on the screen. Acts 17, starting in verse 16. Luke writes this: while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. So Paul, traveling through the city, and he sees at every corner a temple or a shrine or a statue or an altar with images of Athena, Apollo, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Bacchus. The whole Greek pantheon would have been on display in statues of gold, silver, marble, and ivory. And inside these various shrines and temples, sexual promiscuity and immorality was being celebrated both in art and in practice. And Paul is heartbroken. In fact, the text says he is greatly distressed. But notice, he's not distressed just about the behavior or lifestyles of people. He's distressed about what? The idols. Now, why does that matter? Because you see, Paul understood something that followers of Jesus today often forget. And it's that immorality is always rooted in idolatry. Immorality is always rooted in idolatry in some ways. In other words, when you worship something other than God, whether it's money or pleasure or comfort or security, the result is always a lifestyle that falls short of what you're made for. For example, if money is your God, if money is an idol in your life, you'll never believe you have enough. And you'll spend your life trying to get more and more and more, and you'll live with anxiety and greed and fear. Or if pleasure is your God, if all you crave is the experience of bodily pleasure, you'll see your body or other people's bodies as objects to be used for pleasure, even if it's short-lived. But the real problem isn't money or pleasure. In the right context, those can be really good things. The problem is when they become our chief aim and our primary source of security and meaning. The problem is when they become idols. And that's what was happening in Athens. People are searching, they're striving, they're worshiping. They know there's more to life and they're seeking after it, but they've got the wrong God. And that's what breaks Paul's heart. Not just their bad behavior, but their fruitless searching. And I think the church today needs to pause and take a much-needed look in the mirror on this one, because I think we are often too quick to be offended by other people's lifestyles rather than heartbroken about the idols that are behind it. And sometimes the reason we do this is because we have the very same idols in our lives. Sure, we might live a different way, but we can still worship security or comfort or self-reliance. So I think this story invites us both to look for the idols that are in our own lives and to be heartbroken. Not over the lifestyles out there that may offend us, but because people are searching, they're striving, they're worshiping. They know there's more to life and they are seeking after it. They've just got the wrong God. And that's why Paul is so distressed. And so he decides to get involved. Look at verse 17. Luke writes, "So Paul reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there." Now, when we hear the word marketplace, we think shopping, right? As if Paul happened upon a first century farmer's market where they sell fresh vegetables and local artwork or something like that. But the marketplace in that day wasn't just a place to buy goods. It was where you got your news. It was where you interacted with people. It's where entrepreneurs met with investors. It's where politicians shared their ideas and artists shared their work. The marketplace was the cultural center. It was the media center. It was the political center. It was the financial center. And Luke says that Paul is in the marketplace reasoning with people. Meaning he wasn't standing on the corner preaching. He didn't say, "Here's the truth, believe it or else." That word for reasoning is the Greek word for dialogue. And dialogue in that day meant asking questions and listening to other ideas and learning, not just tweeting or posting or declaring stuff. And Paul didn't do this once or twice and then just move on. He was there day by day, meaning he kept going back. And remember, Athens was not a very Christian place. And these people were not living Christian lives. There were 30,000 idols in Athens. One writer said it was easier to find a god than a man in Athens. But Paul didn't hide from that or run from that or stand on the corner and pronounce judgment on it. He engaged with it. And the people of Athens started to take notice. Look at what Luke says in verse 18. He says, "A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, 'What is this babbler trying to say?' Others remarked, 'He seems to be advocating foreign gods.'" Now they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now, just a little background on who these philosophers are and why they are debating with Paul. So the Epicureans, well, who are they? Well, they're basically atheists who believe that truth was entirely relative. And the goal of life isn't to be virtuous or good, but to pursue pleasure, to be happy. Their motto would be something like this: life is short, so just try to enjoy it, because there's no real meaning in life, and once you die, that's it. And by the way, lots of people still think this way today, don't they? People who say, truth is whatever I want it to be, and if it feels good, do it. Now, Stoics, on the other hand, were pantheists who believed God was kind of in everything. The rocks, the trees, the dogs, definitely not the cats, but pretty much everything else. Stoics believed everything was determined by fate. And therefore, the goal of life was just to accept your fate, whatever that may be. So their motto was something like this: life is hard, so just grin and bear it. And this kind of thinking is still around today as well. People who do their best to handle whatever comes their way without complaining, but inside, they don't really have a reason to hope. Well, get this. Both of these groups took interest in Paul. Why? Because the good news of Jesus spoke to the questions they couldn't answer. See, the Epicureans chased pleasure, but they lacked meaning and purpose. The Stoics chased honor and nobility, but they lacked hope in the face of pain and suffering. And so Paul tells them that Jesus can give your life meaning, more so than money or sex or power. And Jesus can give you hope, even when there's no reason to hope. And then Luke writes this remarkable statement. He says, then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Now, here's what I want you to see. Yes, Paul put himself in a position where he could be mocked or even rejected, but he also put himself in a position where he could be invited in. And being invited to the Areopagus was like being invited into the faculty meeting at the top university or an executive meeting at a Fortune 500 company. But remember, Paul didn't start there. Just like Billy Graham didn't start by trying to get an appointment in the White House, Paul started with a broken heart for people searching for answers. And he was consistent, not just in his presentation, but his presence. And now he's standing before the smartest people on the planet, and they want to hear about Jesus. Because the invitation always comes if you're patient, if you're present, if you actually care about people, God will always open a door. And I know COVID has made this difficult because we can't spend as much time in social spaces, but think about how often you go to the same grocery store. Or think about how you visit the same doctor's office or dentist. Or think about the place where you work or where you attend school, even if it's online. Or think about the neighbors you walk by. Are you present in those places, or are you just passing through? Are you focused on the people around you? Are you heartbroken for the questions they're asking, or are you just worried about what's on your agenda? Just this past week, you've heard about these. We mailed out these Easter invitations so that you can write a personal note and invite someone to Easter. It's a chance to create conversation, a chance to show interest in someone's life. Take advantage of it. Because friends, this is how the good news of Jesus changes the world. It starts with presence, with consistency, with listening, with respect, with dialogue, with questions. It starts with answering the questions that people are actually asking. Like, why am I here? Does my life even matter? Does anybody even care about me? Because here's the truth about modern day Epicureans and modern day Stoics. They're still searching for meaning. They're still looking for hope. The question isn't, are they open to good news? The question is, will they invite you in? Will you have earned the right to be heard? Well, Paul earned that right, and he's invited to speak at the Areopagus, which means the hill of Ares, or Mars Hill. And take a look at what he said. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. You see, proclamation comes last, not when Paul first arrived in Athens, but days later, weeks later, maybe even months later. And notice, Paul starts not with the answer, but by acknowledging how they've been searching for one. He says, I see that you're religious. I see that you're searching for answers. I see that you too can sense that there's more to life than what you can see. In fact, I looked at all your idols and I found one that said, to an unknown God. Now, no one knows exactly which idol this actually was. There were 30,000 in Athens. Maybe they were worried they didn't get to all of the gods, so they made this one just to appease any gods they may have missed. We don't know. What we know is that Paul is pointing to their own admission that they don't really know these gods. They don't have a personal relationship with these gods. And then Paul says this, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. In other words, The people of Athens, your gods are way too small. Even the great gold statue of Athena, which can be seen from 40 miles away, too small. Because the God that Paul knows isn't just one out of 30,000 or the best out of 30,000. He is the one true God, the creator of all things, the sustainer of all life. And he doesn't need people to serve him so he can be happy, which, by the way, is what the gods of the ancient world were actually like, fickle and hard to please. He is entirely self-sufficient, and everything happens under his authority. See what Paul's doing? He's describing a big, majestic, all-powerful God, bigger than anything ever conceived in Greek philosophy. Because this is a God who is big enough to worship, big enough to trust, big enough to handle whatever's happening in the world. I love how a pastor named Tim Keller once put it. He said, if you have a God that's small enough to be understood, then he's not big enough to be worshiped. But if you have a God that's big enough to be worshiped, he's big enough to have plans that you don't understand. And when you have a God that big and that in charge, you can finally relax. But Paul didn't just paint a picture of a really big God. Look at verse 27. He says, God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. In other words, this God is bigger than you think, but he's also closer than you think. In fact, he's actually not far from you right now, and he wants a relationship with you right now. You see, this God is not just powerful, he's personal. And whatever you're going through, it isn't just random like the Epicureans would say, or fate like the Stoics would say. God did this so that we would seek him and reach out for him and find him and know him. And then in a moment of genius, Paul actually quotes two different Greek philosophers. He says, for in him, you see these quotes in the text, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. In other words, your own poets and philosophers have been pointing to this. They didn't know who this God was. They weren't thinking about Jesus, but they knew that there was more to the story than just trying to be happy or just grin and bear it. And by the way, one of the biggest lessons of Paul's time in Athens is that he actually knew Greek philosophy, just like St. Patrick knew Celtic culture. And I think one of the reasons why the church is losing its influence in the world today is because we no longer prioritize learning about the culture around us. We just criticize it. Sure, we believe Christianity is true, but not because we've come to understand the claims of Buddhism or Hinduism or secularism or atheism, but just because we think we're right. Or we believe in creation, not because we've wrestled with evolutionary science, but because we actually haven't. Well, here's the thing. Paul won the right to be heard, not just because he was bold in his faith, but because he was educated about theirs. But Paul wasn't finished. He went on to say this, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. How does Paul prove his argument to these brilliant Greek philosophers? He doesn't give them a theory or a new philosophy. The proof is a person. And not just any person or some unknown deity carved into stone, but a resurrected person. And friends, this is what sets Christianity apart. We don't have a different set of rules or religious convictions. We believe the answer is a person. That this infinitely big God became a vulnerable human being who lived and died and was raised from the dead so that we could find him and know him. And here's the good news. You don't have to be smarter or better or more successful for him to love us. We just need to repent. That is, we need to get rid of all the false gods, the lesser gods, the gods that cannot fulfill or satisfy or give us hope. And maybe that's something you need to hear today. Maybe you've been leaning on the God of success or the God of comfort or the God of security, or the God of knowledge, or the God of being a good person. And maybe today is a day to repent, to let go, and discover the God who knew about this moment in your life before time began. He's bigger than you think, and he's closer than you think, and he's better than you think. And if you want to take that next step and believe it, you can do that right now. You can text My Faith to 97000. We would love to follow up and talk to you about what following Jesus looks like and give you an opportunity to be baptized even this Easter Sunday. You could take that step. But before we close, there's one more piece of the story. And it's how the people on Mars Hill responded. Look at what Luke says. He says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Here's the thing. Some people will sneer. No matter how well you reason, no matter how much you care, no matter how intelligently you speak, the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead will always be a stumbling block to some. And some people will always sneer, just like they sneered at Paul, just like they sneered at Jesus. And by the way, that's the cost of loving Athens. But here's the thing, that wasn't the only response. Look at this. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Yes, some will sneer, but some will be curious. Some will have more questions. Some will want to hear more. And by the way, here at North Shore, we have an experience called Alpha that is designed for people who have questions, who are curious, who want to know more. And I know most of you have heard about Alpha, but some of you have still never invited someone to be part of it. But I have to tell you, it is the single best way to give people a safe space to dialogue and have conversation. And it changes lives. And it can change the life of someone you care about. And we're actually kicking off another round of Alpha this April. So make that invitation, because some people want to hear more. But then there was a third response. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris, a member, and a number of others. Some sneered. Some had some questions. But some believed. Right then and there. Now, some scholars consider this moment actually kind of a failure because Paul didn't actually start a church in Athens. But he started a conversation where no one thought a conversation about Jesus was even possible. And I think this was the first step in a slow but steady cultural shift. You see, within a few hundred years, the great thinkers of the Western world were not Epicureans or Stoics, they were Christians. And the ideas they were debating weren't just about whether something was new or interesting. It was about how to come to know this God even better. And who's to say that process didn't start with one of those changed lives on Mars Hill that day? Because if Jesus can reach Athens, he can reach anyone. And who's to say that can't happen again? Through one changed life here in Kirkland or Kenmore or Bothell or Woodinville or Seattle or at UW. But for that to happen, we have to dive into our culture too. Like Paul, we can't hide from it or just criticize it. We have to engage with it, learn about it, study it, ask God to break our hearts for it. Just like Paul, who didn't walk away from Athens, he dove in. Just like St. Patrick, who didn't walk away from the Celtic tribes in Ireland who kidnapped him, he dove in. Just like Jesus, who didn't walk away from this world, he dove in all the way to a cross and all the way out of a tomb to prove that God is bigger than you think, and he's closer than you think, and he's better than you think. And you can search the world high and low. You can compare him to every other god or idol or image, but there is no one like him. There is no one like him. And here's the thing. I want to be part of telling his story. I want to see him reach the unreachable and do the impossible. I want to see people who are desperately searching for answers find those answers in him. Well, how about you? How about you? So let's pray. Jesus, we believe that you are the answer. You are the answer that every human heart needs, that every question points towards. And so we ask that you would break our hearts today for the world around us, the culture that you've placed us, the culture you've called us to reach, even if it feels difficult or impossible or scary or even offensive. May our hearts break in such a way that we would lean in and dive in to be present with those around us, to reach out, to start conversations, to be in dialogue, to take those questions seriously that the people around us are asking. And help us live lives that always point back to you, that you're bigger than we think, and you're closer than we think, and you're better than we think. And Jesus, we thank you that you prove that by walking out of that tomb, and we can't wait to celebrate that 2 weeks from now at Easter. And so Jesus, be with us as we go through this week, and we ask this in your name, and everybody said, amen.